Here is something that most Christians, including most African Christians, do not know. The word Trinity was coined in Africa. The Nicene Creed, a statement of faith that billions of Christians have recited for 17 centuries, was shaped in large parts by African theologians. The first Christian author to write extensively in Latin was African. The bishop who defined how the church should handle persecution was African. The philosopher who wrote what many consider the first autobiography in Western literature and who remains the most quoted theologian in Christian history was African. Tertullian, Cyprian, Origen, Athanasius, Augustine. Before the church was German or English or Roman in the way we meant it today, before the papacy as we know it existed, before cathedrals rose across Europe, before the Reformation split the Western Church, Africa led Christianity. Not as a minor contributor, not as a footnote, as the intellectual, theological, and in many ways spiritual center of the faith. And then, within a few centuries, Christianity almost completely vanished from the continent that had built it. Not gradually, not quietly. Whole churches gone. Entire Christian population converted or displaced. The most theologically productive region in the ancient world fell silent. What happened? This is what this video is about. Welcome back. We have been walking through the figures who shaped early Christianity: Nicaea, Athanasius, Augustine. Today, we pull back and look at the whole picture. We are going to talk about the African church, where it came from, what it built, why it fell, and why, if you are an African Christian, the history belongs to you more than you may have been told. Christianity did not begin in Europe. It began in the Middle East, spread immediately into North Africa, and found some of its earliest and most fertile soil on the African continent, decades before it became a significant force anywhere in Western or Northern Europe. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that the infant Jesus was taken to Egypt to escape Herod. Whether you read that as history or theology, it signals something. Egypt was a place where God's story had roots. By the end of the 4th century, Alexandria, the great Egyptian polity on the Mediterranean, had one of the most significant Christian communities in the world. The Catechetical School of Alexandria, founded traditionally around 190 AD, was the ancient world's equivalent of a great theological university. It attracted the finest minds of the era, trained them in scripture and philosophy, and sent them out into a church that was still figuring out what it believed and how to defend it. Christianity also arrived early in Ethiopia, by some accounts carried by the Ethiopian official, baptized by Philip the Evangelist in Acts chapter 8. The one was reading from Isaiah in his chariot on the road to Gaza. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its origin to the 4th century, making it one of the oldest continuously existing Christian bodies on earth. In North Africa, modern-day Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, the church grew rapidly through the 2nd and 3rd centuries, spreading through urban centers and eventually into the countryside, producing a Christian culture of enormous vitality and ferocious theological energy. It was from this world that the African fathers emerged. The first name you need to know is Tertullian, born around 155 AD in Carthage, in what is now Tunisia. He was the son of a Roman centurion, trained in Greek and Latin, and became a lawyer in Rome before his conversion to Christianity somewhere in his 30s. Tertullian was the first church father to write extensively in Latin and set the tone for how many subsequent church fathers approach their theological discussions. Before Tertullian, serious Christian theology was written almost entirely in Greek. He changed that permanently. Every Latin-speaking theologian who came after him, including Augustine, stood on the foundation he laid. But his contributions went far beyond language. Tertullian introduced a new term to describe the relationship within the Godhead, the Trinity. That word, Trinitas in Latin, which billions of Christians use casually today, was forged in Carthage by a North African lawyer turned theologian in the early 3rd century. He also developed early formulations of the distinction between the three persons of the Godhead, concept that would be refined at Nicaea and Constantinople a century later. The theological vocabulary that the Council of Nicaea used to settle the Arian controversy was, in significant part, vocabulary that Tertullian had pioneered. By the end of the 2nd century, the church in Carthage had become large, firmly established, and well organized, and was rapidly becoming a powerful force in North Africa. By the year 225, there were approximately 70 bishops in Numidia and proconsularies, the two provinces of Roman Africa. Tertullian was brilliant, combative, and uncompromising. He famously asked, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Challenging the use of pagan philosophy in Christian thought. He made enemies. In his later years, he drifted towards the Montanist movement, a charismatic fringe sect that caused controversy. His legacy is complicated, but his contribution is undeniable. Tertullian had been called the father of Latin Christianity and the father of Western theology, a North African from Carthage. A generation after Tertullian came Cyprian, bishop of Carthage from 249 AD until his martyrdom in 258 AD. He was born around the beginning of the 3rd century in North Africa, perhaps at Carthage, where he received a classical education. Before his conversion, he was a leading member of a legal fraternity in Carthage, an orator and a teacher of rhetoric. He was baptized around the age of 35, and within 2 years, remarkably, controversially, against his own wishes, he was appointed Bishop of Carthage. The largest Christian city in the Western Mediterranean had chosen a man who had been a Christian for barely 2 years to lead it. He rose to the challenge with astonishing speed. His episcopate was defined by 2 crises that would have broken lesser men. The first was the Decian persecution, one of the most systematic campaigns against Christianity the Roman Empire had yet attempted. Emperor Decius ordered every citizen to perform a public act of sacrifice to the Roman gods and obtain a certificate proving compliance. For Christians, this was a direct demand to apostatize, to publicly deny their faith. Many refused. They were imprisoned, tortured, executed. Others, far more than the church had expected, complied. They sacrificed. They took the certificate. When the persecution ended, the church was left with a devastating question. What do you do with those who are denied the faith under prayer? Could they be restored? On what terms? Cyprian wrote extensively on this question and developed a theology of church unity and reconciliation that still shapes how Christians think about repentance and restoration. His answer, neither brutal exclusion nor soft permissiveness, but a structured, humble path of restoration, became the model. The second crisis was a plague between 249 and 262 AD. A devastating epidemic, now called the Plague of Cyprian, swept through the Roman Empire. At its height, 5,000 people a day were dying in Rome alone. Cyprian's response was extraordinary. He called his congregation not to flee but to serve, to care for the sick regardless of whether they were Christian or pagan. He organized systematic relief efforts. He wrote a treatise on mortality that addressed the fear of death with theological depth and pastoral warmth. He was beheaded on September 14, 258 AD. During the Valerian persecution, he became one of the most venerated martyrs in the early church. His theological contribution to ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, remains foundational. His phrase, later interpreted and debated endlessly, still echoes, "Outside the church, there is no salvation." From Carthage, North Africa. While Tertullian and Cyprian were building the Latin church in Carthage, something equally extraordinary was happening eastward along the coast in Alexandria. Origen of Alexandria, born around 185 AD, was arguably the most prolific and certainly the most intellectually daring theologian of the entire Asian church. He is estimated to have written somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 works, though most have been lost to time. He came from a Christian family. His father was martyred when Origen was around 17, and by some accounts, the young Origen tried to rush out and join his father in martyrdom, only stopped because his mother he disclosed. He became head of the catechetical school of Alexandria in his late teens, an extraordinary responsibility for an extraordinarily gifted young man. Under his leadership, the school became the greatest center of Christian intellectual life in the ancient world, attracting students from across the empire. He mastered Hebrew to read the Old Testament in the original. He produced the Exemplar, a monumental edition of the Old Testament in 6 parallel columns, comparing different versions of the text. He wrote commentaries on virtually every book of the Bible. He developed the systematic theology of divine providence, the soul, and the nature of salvation that would influence every major theologian who came after him. He was also controversial. Some of his speculative ideas were condemned as heretical after his death. The church had never been entirely sure what to do with Origen. He is too brilliant to ignore and too unorthodox in places to canonize cleanly. But the influence is undeniable. Athanasius, whom we covered in the previous video, was shaped by Alexandria theology. The argument that won at Nicaea grew in part from the intellectual soil that Origen had prepared. Alexandria, Egypt, Africa. If you have been following this series, you already know the next two names. Athanasius of Alexandria, the Egyptian bishop, who defended the full divinity of Christ at Nicaea, and spent 5 exiles refusing to compromise. The man who held the line against 4 emperors, Athanasius contra modum. Egyptian, African. And Augustine of Hippo, the restless northern African genius from Tagaste in modern Algeria, who gave the Western Church its greatest account of grace, original sin, and the meaning of history, who wrote Confession, the first autobiography in Western literature, and The City of God, one of the most consequential works of political theology ever produced, Algeria African. When you lay the names out together, Tertullian, Cyprian, Origen, Athanasius, Augustine, you are looking at the intellectual and theological architecture of Christianity itself. Many African Americans, Christians and non-Christians, do not realize that some of the most influential theologians and pastors originated from Northern Africa. And the same is true for African Christians everywhere. The church history that is taught, the paintings in Western museums, the European faces on the covers of theological textbooks has obscured something that the historical records make unmistakable. Africans did not receive Christianity from Europe in significant ways. Europe received Christianity from Africa. The fathers originating from North Africa should be seen as the founders of the Latin Church and its proper spirituality. At the height of African Christianity, around the time of the Arab conquest in the 7th century, there were 400 bishoprics in existence across North Africa. 400 organized, structured, theologically active Christian communities from Libya to Morocco. But beneath the impressive surface, the African church carried weaknesses that would prove fatal. The first was Donatist Schism. The Donatist controversy began in the early 4th century, another consequence of the Diocletian persecution. The question was the same one Cyprian had faced, sharpened to a knife's edge. Could a bishop who had handed over scripture to the authorities during persecution still validly administer the sacrament? The Donatists said no, emphatically, permanently, with no possibility of restoration. The church must be pure. Bishops who had compromised were invalid. Their sacraments were invalid. Anyone baptized by them must be rebaptized. Augustine fought the Donatists for decades and produced his greatest ecclesiological work in doing so. The controversy divided the African church deeply, setting communities against community, creating lasting bitterness and factional violence that weakened the church's ability to present a unified front. Then came the Vandals. In 439 AD, the Vandals took Carthage. They were followers of African Christianity, the very theology that Athanasius had spent his life opposing. Under Vandal rule, Donatist and Catholic churches alike were destroyed. Members of the clergy of both churches were killed, and some were sent into exile to work at forced labor. The Vandals held North Africa for roughly a century before the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian reconquered the reign in 534 AD. A brief exhausted recovery followed. But the church that emerged from Vandal occupation was weaker than the one that had entered it. Bishoprics had been destroyed, leadership had been killed or scattered. The theological energy had made Africa the intellectual capital of the Christian world had dissipated. The church at that time lacked the backbone of a monastic tradition and was still suffering from the aftermath of heresies, including the Donatist heresy, and this contributed to the early obliteration of the church in the present-day Maghreb. The monastic tradition, the Desert Fathers, the communities that had sheltered Athanasius in his exiles and preserved Augustine's writings, survived in Egypt, in Carthage and the western regions. It was far thinner on the ground. The African church was exhausted, divided, and vulnerable. And then came the Arab armies. In the early 7th century, the Islamic prophet Muhammad's teaching had united the Arab tribes under a single banner. The armies moved with a speed and cohesion that the fractured late Roman world could not match. By 642 AD, Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt and a vital center of Christian thought, had fallen. The city where Origen had written, where Athanasius had been bishop, where the catechetical school had trained the greatest minds of the ancient church, fell to Arab forces within a decade of Muhammad's death. By 697 AD, Carthage fell to the Arabs. Repeated attacks had already devastated and depopulated the country. The Latinized upper class fled to Europe. The conquest itself was not always violent. In many places, the Arab rulers initially allowed Christian communities to continue. They were taxed, restricted, and pressured, but not always immediately eliminated. The imposition of the jizya, a tax levied on non-Muslims, was both a financial burden and a symbol of subjugation. Many chose to convert to Islam, drawn by the promise of lower taxes and better social standing. Over time, the Arabic language and Islamic culture became dominant, eroding the Christian identity that had flourished for centuries. But the process was not instantaneous. It took centuries. There are reports that Roman Catholic faith persisted in the region from Tripolitania to present-day Morocco for several centuries after the completion of the Arab conquest by 700 AD. A Christian community is recorded in 114 in Kalal in central Algeria. There are reports of Christian inhabitants and a bishop in the city of Kairouan around 1150 AD, a significant event since the city was founded by Arab Muslims around 680 AD as the administrative center after their conquest. Pockets of Christianity survived, quietly, diminishingly. A letter in Catholic Church archives from the 4th century show that there were still 4 bishoprics left in North Africa, a sharp decline from the over 400 bishops in existence at the time of the Arab conquest, 400 to 4. The disappearance was nearly total. In most areas where Christianity was confronted by Islam, the 4 centuries after the Gira, the Christian religion suffered setback or was eclipsed in some measure, but it did not disappear in North Africa. However, Christianity was not merely eclipsed, it was supplanted. But here's what the story often leaves out. Not everything was lost. In Egypt, Coptic Christianity survived the Arab conquest and has continued. Unbroken to this day, Coptic Christianity survives today in Egypt, and some 10% of Egyptians enjoy that faith. The Coptic Church, the Church of Athanasius, of the Desert Fathers, of the great catechetical school of Alexandria, is one of the oldest continuously existing Christian institutions in the world. It has survived Roman persecution, Arab conquest, Crusader conflict, Ottoman rule, and modern sectarian prayer. And then there is Ethiopia. Christianity is the dominant religion in Ethiopia and has been unbroken since at least the 3rd or 4th century. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has maintained an unbroken Christian tradition for over 17 centuries. Its liturgy is ancient. Its theology is deep. Its monasteries are among the oldest in the world. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved from solid stone in the 12th century, stand as one of the most extraordinary achievements of Christian architecture anywhere on earth. When people speak of African and Christianity, as if the faith was imported from Europe in the colonial era, they are ignoring 17 centuries of unbroken Ethiopian Christianity. They are ignoring the Coptic Church. They are ignoring Tertullian and Cyprian and Origen and Athanasius and Augustine. The narrative that Christianity is a white man's religion brought to Africa by missionaries is historically illiterate. Christianity was shaped by African and defended by the African bishops and has been continuously practiced on African soil for nearly 2,000 years. So why does this matter? Why spend a video on the fall of a church that fell centuries ago? Because history is not just information, it is identity. If you're an African Christian, whether you are in Lagos or Nairobi or Accra or London or Atlanta, and someone tells you that you received your faith from European missionaries in the 19th century, you now know enough to tell a more complete story. Your faith has African roots that go back to the 4th century. The theology you confess was shaped by African hands. The creeds you recite were influenced by African bishops. The intellectual tradition you inherit was in many of its defining moments built on African soil. That does not resolve everything. The colonial era happened. Missionaries brought Christianity to sub-Saharan Africa in ways that were tangled with empire. And that history is real and complicated and deserves honest engagement. But the deeper story, the one that precedes all of that, is that African and Christianity have been intertwined from the very beginning. Tertullian coined the word Trinity in Carthage. Athanasius refused to compromise in Alexandria. Augustine wrote his confession in Hippo. The Ethiopian church has been worshipping since the 4th century without interruption. The history belongs to you, not to be weaponized, not to be used as a tribal point scoring exercise, but to be known because you cannot understand what Christianity is, or where it came from, or what it cost to preserve it, without understanding what happened in North Africa between the 1st and 7th centuries. This series exists to tell that story honestly. If it is valuable to you, subscribe, because next time we are moving forward in history. We are going to look at the Great Schism of 1054, the moment the one Christian church became two, and why Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism have never fully healed the break that happened that year. It is a story with echoes that reach into every ecumenical conversation happening in the church today. See you then.